civilization is often described as the thing that saved humans from brutality. The moment we stopped being ruled by raw survival instinct and started being ruled by law, order, and shared agreement. This framing is comforting, and it is also almost entirely backwards. The earliest legal and social systems humans built were not gentler than the chaos they replaced. In many documented cases, they were considerably more brutal, precisely because they had to be. A law with no enforcement mechanism isn't a law. It's a suggestion, and small early communities living on a survival margin could not afford suggestions. What emerges when you look honestly at the earliest documented legal and ritual systems across multiple independent civilizations is a consistent pattern. Order was purchased at a price, and the price was almost always paid in bodies, pain, and public spectacle designed specifically to be unforgettable. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into a stone stele in ancient Babylon around 1754 BCE, remains one of the earliest and most complete legal codes ever recovered, and it is instructive precisely because of how explicit it is about proportional retaliation as the organizing principle of justice. The famous formulation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, wasn't metaphorical. It was literal, specific, and enforced with a level of anatomical precision that modern legal systems have entirely abandoned. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's son was to be put to death. Not the builder's son. The logic wasn't about punishing the guilty individual directly. It was about creating a symmetry of law so precise, so mathematically exact, that the deterrent value would extend to every person who might ever consider cutting a corner in construction. This principle, sometimes called talionic law, appears independently across civilizations that had no contact with one another, which suggests it wasn't a cultural accident, but something closer to a convergent solution to a universal problem. How do you make punishment feel proportionate enough that a community accepts it as justice, while making it severe enough that it actually deters the behavior in the first place? The answer, arrived at again and again in isolation, was to make the punishment mirror the crime with as much literal precision as physically possible. Trial by ordeal represents a different, and in some ways stranger, category of early legal brutality, one built not around proportional punishment but around the belief that physical suffering could reveal supernatural truth. In medieval European practice, an accused person might be required to carry a red-hot iron bar a specified distance, or plunge an arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone. The wound was then bandaged and inspected several days later. If he was healing cleanly, the accused was innocent. The divine had intervened to protect them. If he was infected or festering, guilt was confirmed. What's striking about this system isn't just its cruelty, but its internal logic. It wasn't understood by its practitioners as arbitrary torture. It was understood as a legitimate evidentiary procedure, one that placed the actual judgment in the hands of forces the community considered more reliable than human testimony, which in a world with no forensic science and frequently corrupt human witnesses was not an entirely irrational position, however horrifying the mechanism. Some trial by ordeal systems were even more elaborate. In parts of West Africa, certain communities practiced ordeals involving the ingestion of poisonous bark extracts, where survival or death was interpreted as a direct verdict from ancestral or spiritual authority. The physiological reality, that dosage, individual tolerance, and the specific preparation of the poison likely determined outcomes far more than any question of actual guilt, didn't undermine the system's authority within the communities that practiced it. The ordeal wasn't meant to be a fair coin flip. It was meant to be an unambiguous, final, and socially unchallengeable verdict, and brutality was the mechanism that made the verdict feel legitimate rather than arbitrary. Public execution as ritual, rather than simply punishment, is one of the most consistent patterns across early civilizations, and the consistency itself is worth sitting with. A private execution accomplishes only one thing: it removes a specific individual from the community. A public execution, staged with ceremony, witnessed by the maximum possible number of community members, and often extended in duration specifically to maximize visible suffering, accomplishes something entirely different. It functions as a piece of communicated information, broadcast to an entire population simultaneously about exactly what the community is willing to do to protect its own order. Ancient Rome's practice of crucifixion illustrates this function with brutal clarity. Crucifixion was not primarily used as a method of execution for ordinary crimes. It was reserved specifically for slaves who rebelled, for enemies of the state, and for crimes considered a direct threat to the social order itself. The method was chosen specifically for its visibility and duration. Crucifixions were performed along public roads, often for extended periods, specifically so that as many people as possible would see them repeatedly over the longest possible span of time. Following the suppression of the Spartacus slave rebellion in 71 BCE, Roman authorities crucified an estimated 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way, a public road stretching for miles, spaced at intervals specifically calculated to maximize the number of travelers who would witness them. This wasn't excessive cruelty applied without purpose. It was a communication strategy executed at civilizational scale, using human bodies as the medium. Ritual scarification and body modification practices found across numerous early tribal societies occupy a different category entirely. Not punishment for wrongdoing, but a form of controlled, socially sanctioned suffering used to mark transitions in status, and in doing so to structure the entire framework of who held authority within a community and why. In various documented societies across sub-Saharan Africa, Papua New Guinea, and parts of the Amazon basin, initiation rites for young men frequently involved deliberately inflicted pain, scarification, tooth extraction, prolonged isolation combined with physical hardship, or ritualized combat administered by community elders as a mandatory precondition for full adult status and the rights that came with it. The function here is distinct from punitive law but operates on a related principle. Pain as a mechanism for creating unforgeable, permanent social information. A scar cannot be faked convincingly. It cannot be claimed without having actually been earned through the ordeal that produced it. In societies without written records, without centralized bureaucracy, and without any reliable way to verify claims about a person's status or history, physically permanent markers created through witnessed, communal suffering solve the genuine information problem. Who has proven themselves capable of enduring hardship for the community? The scar answers the question in a way that testimony alone cannot. This same logic extended to governance structures themselves. In numerous early tribal councils, positions of authority were frequently earned not through inheritance or accumulated wealth alone, but through demonstrated capacity to endure or inflict controlled violence on behalf of the group. A warrior who had survived documented ordeals, who bore the scars of proven combat, or who had successfully overseen the brutal but effective administration of communal punishment, carried social capital that couldn't be manufactured or inherited. Brutality, administered correctly and survived visibly, functioned as a credentialing system in societies with no other reliable mechanism for verifying who actually deserved trust and authority. What connects the Babylonian stela, the European ordeal, the Roman road lined with crucified bodies, and the scarred initiate returning to his village is not simple cruelty for its own sake. It's a consistent, independently discovered solution to the same foundational problem every early civilization faced. How do you create order, compliance, and trustworthy hierarchy among populations of people who have no other reliable mechanism? No forensic science, no centralized enforcement bureaucracy, no written contracts binding enough to be trusted on their own, to guarantee that agreements will be honored and that authority is legitimately earned rather than simply claimed. The uncomfortable truth embedded in this pattern is that brutality wasn't a failure of early civilization. In a very real mechanistic sense, it was the technology that made civilization possible at all. Before writing, before centralized courts, before any system capable of enforcing abstract agreements through anything other than direct, visible, memorable consequence, physical suffering, inflicted publicly, deliberately, and with ritual precision, was often the only tool available that actually worked at the scale required to hold a growing population together. None of this means the systems were fair by any modern standard, or that the suffering inflicted was proportionate to genuine guilt in the way it claimed to be. Trial by ordeal condemned innocent people based on wound-healing patterns that had nothing to do with truth. Talionic law occasionally punished children for their parents' failures. Public execution as spectacle normalized extraordinary cruelty as civic entertainment. But understanding why these systems emerged independently again and again across civilizations with no contact with one another reveals something genuinely important about the actual mechanics of how order gets built from chaos. Not through gentleness, but through the earliest human societies discovering, through trial and error measured in generations, exactly how much visible suffering was required to make a population believe, collectively and durably, that the rules would actually be enforced. Have a happy day.